Hi, my name's Dr. Philip Wilson, and I teach philosophy at the University of East Anglia. Every autumn, we always take our first years on what we call a philosophy walk at Norwich. Now, strangely enough, we can't do that this year, so we're trying to move this online so that you can actually walk around Norwich and do philosophy. Now, of course, that does actually raise the question, doesn't it? What is philosophy? And in a sense, I wish I knew. I know that philosophy starts with a sense of wonder at the world, and today, as we walk around, we're going to be looking at a number of figures from the history of Norwich who've had this sense of wonder and who, in a sense, force us to ask questions. So that's maybe a second thing about philosophy. We've got the notion of wonder, and what about asking questions about the world, not taking things for granted? Philosophy isn't a subject that you have to learn things by heart and then reproduce them in an exam, and then you've done well, then you're a philosopher. Philosophy is more, I'd say, it was an activity. And the people we're going to look at today are all going to raise these questions. And what they're inviting us to do, I think, is to join with them in this activity of thinking about the world. And this goes right back to one of the earliest philosophers in the West, whose name was Socrates. Socrates actually ended up being executed because of the profession of philosophy. And at his trial, he actually said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think that's our third point about philosophy. The unexamined life is not worth living. Philosophy is a subject that you can do on the move. Many philosophers have been great walkers, and N. Taleb has said, if you want to be a philosopher, walk slowly. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to walk around Norwich, which is a really wonderful place as well. Teaching at University of East Anglia, one of the things I'm very proud of really is the city to which UEA is attached, if you like. It's an absolutely fantastic place. And one idea behind the philosophy walk is to actually bring everybody into Norwich and get everyone to actually have a walk around and see what sort of place it is. Now, today, obviously, we can't do that in person, but we can do it online. And I hope that if you're watching this, you will actually take time to come into Norwich to walk around safely, observing distance, using masks when necessary, and just see why Norwich brands itself as a fine city. I'm standing here at the cathedral. We're very grateful to the cathedral for their permission to do our filming here. I'm standing here behind the cathedral, which is an ancient cathedral, one of the oldest in Britain, one of the most beautiful in the world, really. It's a Norman foundation. And in a second, we're going to move off to the grave of Edith Cavell. But here I am at Norwich Cathedral at the beginning of our philosophy walk. Thank you for being with me. Here I am at the grave of Edith Cavell, who, as you'll see from the dates, was born in 1865 and died in 1915. That's clearly during the First World War. She was executed by firing squad. She had been accused of helping Allied prisoners of war to escape from Brussels, where she was teaching in a nursing school. In fact, if you go to Brussels today, you'll find the main hospital is named after her. Edith Cavell was born in Norwich, became a nurse, became a very good nurse, and to the extent that we actually name our building for nursing education at UEA after her. And then her career took her to Belgium and eventually took her to a firing squad. Well, you might ask yourself, how does that make her a philosopher? Well, you answer that question in one way, but one reason I like to stop at this grave when I take groups around Norwich is because I'm very, very interested in a French philosopher called Simone Weil, who died in the Second World War in 1943 in London, where she was working for the French resistance in exile. And in one of Simone Weil's books, we actually find the quotation, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred for anybody," which is actually a quotation from Edith Cavell and is actually written around this grave. How on earth did that quotation find itself in the work of Simone Weil? Well, nobody knows, but one guess is that if you are ever in London and walking past the National Portrait Gallery, you'll see a memorial to Edith Cavell with these words sculpted on it. And it's thought that when she was living in London, Simone Weil must have seen these words and must have put them into her own work. And so we can see in here the power of ideas. And that's another important thing about philosophy, that ideas can be very, very powerful. The ideas that Socrates had all those years ago are still with us. The ideas that Simone Weil had in London working for the French government, French resistance in exile, are still with us. And Edith Cavell's notion that patriotism is not enough, we've got to go beyond patriotism, that notion is still with us today. We're now going to move on to the statue of Julian of Norwich, in which case we'll look at a very different figure from Edith Cavell, but again one who is very much still with us. Thank you. Here I am now at the front of Norwich Cathedral, and over my shoulder you'll see the statue of Julian of Norwich, who died in around about 1416, it's thought. Now, why is Julian still remembered today, and in what sense can we say she was a philosopher? Well, first of all, Julian is known as the mother of English prose writing. In fact, if you go to UEA, you will find a whole building that's named after her, because she's so important in the history of English literature. This is the first real writer of English prose. Now, it's a very different sort of English, so if you do read Julian, you have to read her in translation, unless, of course, you can read Middle English. We talk of Chaucer as the father of English poetry. We talk of Julian as the mother of English prose. Why else might we remember her? Well, secondly, because of course she's a woman writer. Now, if you look through the English canon, you don't find a great many women writers. We're finding more now because we're actually looking rather than ignoring these people. But she's if you like, a proto-feminist. I don't think we can call her a feminist because she lived too long ago, and that's a question we have all the time. The word feminism, she wouldn't have known what you're talking about. But I think we can call her a proto-feminist. But the main reason that Julian is remembered today is because she was a mystic. Julian was literally walled up in a church not very far from here. A wall was actually built around the cell that she was in, leaving just a small hole for things to come out and things to come in. And that's where Julian spent most of her life. And in this cell, she wrote her great masterpiece, The Revelations of Divine Love, which actually tell us some visions she had of Jesus and his message to her. For example, he actually gave her a hazelnut and said, "This is the whole of reality." Now, what can she have meant by that? So I say Julian is a mystic. Now, what is a mystic? Well, a mystic is somebody who claims that he or she knows true reality. As I stand here, I kind of believe that I'm in Norwich. I kind of think I'm in Norwich. There's a very interesting question. Do I know if I'm in Norwich or not? And that's a philosophical question to all intents and purposes. I kind of think that I know if I walk across that road without taking care, I could have an accident. And therefore, I am going to take care when I walk across that road. But what about, say, God? Is it possible to know that there is a God? Or is that all about belief? Julian, in a way, thought you could know there was a God. And that's why we call her a mystic. And that is a really interesting and very important philosophical question. And this is the sort of thing you do study if you do a philosophy degree. Let's go back to Edith Cavell for a second. She was actually executed for her political actions. Well, if you're interested in that sort of thing, you could study the philosophy of politics. You could study political philosophy. You could look at thinkers like Karl Marx and the contribution that they have made to philosophy. And if you're interested in something like mysticism or faith, you could study the philosophy of religion, which applies philosophy to religious phenomena. Now, how do you do that? Well, I suppose with philosophy, there are two things we can look at. First of all, our reason, what we think, and secondly, evidence. We can actually look for evidence. And that's a very good question. What evidence is there for what you believe in? If I believe that it's dangerous to walk across that road without looking, what's my evidence for that? Well, clearly I've done it in the past, and I've known that I've really had to take care because there are these things called cars that come at me, and that's my experience. And immediately we see all these questions rising just by looking at the statue of Julian and by reading her work and listening to what she has to say to us today. Philosophical questions arise, and that's, in a sense, the great joy of doing a degree in philosophy or about thinking about philosophy in general. And that's why today we still remember Julian of Norwich. I'm now standing in front of the Octagon Chapel with a very enthusiastic seagull at one side of me. Now, the Octagon Chapel does what it says on the tin. It does actually have 8 sides, and it's really worth looking at. Some UEA students like it so much that they actually stay on to get married here because marriages is one of their specialities. It's a Unitarian chapel. Now, what does Unitarian mean? Unitarians are the people who denied the Trinity, Christians, but decided that God was not in 3 people, 3 persons. God is just one. There is just only one God. And these days, the Unitarians are very much into dialogue with other religions like Islam or Buddhism. We're here because of Harriet Martineau, a Norwich resident whose father was actually Dean of the Octagon Chapel. Harriet Martineau died in 1876. She's remembered for 2 things. First of all, she was a translator. She translated the French philosopher Auguste Comte. And I like this because it reminds me of the importance of translation to philosophy. Philosophy is written in what languages? Depends what you're looking at, doesn't it? But on our modules at UEA, we will study philosophy that was originally written in English, so there's no problem, but also in French, in German, in Latin, in Greek, in Sanskrit, in Pali, and Arabic. Now, you'd have to know quite a lot of languages to be able to read those in the original texts. So translation is important, and that's one thing that Harriet Martineau shows us. The second reason she's remembered today is because she's regarded by historians as the first female sociologist. Now, you may think, isn't this supposed to be a philosophy walk, and what's sociology doing on this walk? And my answer would be that philosophy has to be in dialogue with other subjects if it's going to actually make progress. Think of science, for example. Science is coming up with new ideas all the time. Think of when Newton came along with his new ideas, or Einstein, or the new ideas that are coming out of quantum physics at the moment. Philosophers examine these ideas. They look at them. They actually say, what does it mean to be a scientist? What does it mean to have a scientific attitude to the world? And by doing so, they have this subject, philosophy of science. There is philosophy of religion. We saw that at the cathedral. There is philosophy of translation. And if you're interested in these sort of issues, then one area you might like to explore is the philosophy of social science. Following Harriet Martineau's footsteps, what does it mean to be a sociologist? What does it mean by the fact that we actually live in societies? What does it mean that different societies have got different ideas about what the good is, for example? If you went back to the Middle Ages, for example, in Norwich, and walked around, you'd have seen corpses hanging up of people who've been executed. Well, you don't see that today. What's going on? And these are the sorts of questions that philosophers ask. And also they're the sorts of questions that philosophers answer. So the Octagon Chapel in Norwich, we're very grateful to them for allowing us to film here. The memory of Harriet Martineau, and remembering also that philosophy, if it's going to make progress, has got to be interdisciplinary. Here I'm now at the Quaker Meeting House in Norwich, and many thanks to the Quaker community for allowing us to film here. And I'm going to be talking about Amelia Opie, who died in 1853. Amelia Opie was a Quaker. Well, it's an interesting question, who were the Quakers? Because she was actually a convert to Quakerism. The Quakers were founded as part of the English Reformation by George Fox. And something I always found very interesting about the Quakers is that they don't really look at what particular points of doctrine you believe in. They look at the way you behave and what sort of beliefs you have about the way the world should be run. So if you were to want to become a Quaker, they wouldn't be saying to you, do you believe in God? Are you Christian, etc.? They'd be saying, do you think that people should have enough to eat? Do you think that pollution is a massive problem in the world? That's the sort of opinion they'd be interested in. Well, Amelia Opie was a novelist, but more interestingly, she was a very, very vehement opponent of slavery, and she co-founded the Ladies' League Against Slavery, which sounds very, very genteel, but they managed to actually send 200,000 signatures to Parliament, and by doing so, they were instrumental in actually making slavery illegal. Now, from a philosophical point of view, this is very interesting. If you have a belief, shouldn't you act on it? If you, for example, many people think that eating animals is wrong. Well, doesn't that actually mean you should make some sort of commitment in your lifestyle to this? If you really think that slavery is wrong, like Amelia Opie did, doesn't that actually mean that you should do something about it? Well, that's what she did, and that's what drew her to Quakerism, and that's what drew her to action as well. Now, if this is the sort of thing that interests you, then in a sense you're looking at ethics. You're looking at how we should live. What makes a good life? What makes a good person? These are deeply ethical questions, and ethics is a part of philosophy. It's a subject, for example, you can take as part of your philosophy degree. And the point is not really to learn a lot about ethics. Ethicists always say the point is ultimately to be a good person and to make this a better world. It's interesting again that, and in some ways it's so easy to take for granted, that I'm talking here about another woman philosopher. When you look at the great canon of philosophy, you'll find that you don't seem to come across many women, but they are there, and perhaps it's been the fault of Western philosophy that we haven't looked for these people. But today we've been looking at women philosophers from Norwich, and this is really, really important. And I think this is something that makes this woman a great woman, because she refused to let the fact that she was a woman keep her silent, for example. Just as Julian of Norwich was a woman at a time when women were not really regarded very highly, and yet she refused to keep silent. She wrote down her book, and she still speaks to us. And today these women still speak to us, and I think that's really, really important. And the whole notion of women in philosophy is one which is being re-examined, and that has to be a good thing. Here I am now at Norwich Marketplace, which is a very lovely marketplace, and on my right we've got the statue of Sir Thomas Browne, who died in 1682. Browne was a Norwich doctor. He's actually buried in the church to my left, the Church of St Peter Mancroft. And Browne wrote a very famous book called The Religion of a Doctor. It had a Latin title. It's called Religio Medici, The Religion of a Doctor. Browne was a philosopher. He actually was a philosopher as well as a doctor, and he read the classical philosophers with great interest. Now, the classics have always been a great inspiration to philosophers. People like, we've already mentioned Socrates, but what about people like Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or Seneca? Well, Browne read them all, and the people he actually sided with were the skeptics. The skeptics are the people who really wonder, absolutely the opposite of Julian of Norwich, how can we know anything? How can I actually know that I'm here? Maybe I'm not here at all. Maybe this is just a dream. Maybe I'm a part of somebody else's dream. Maybe I can never know anything, never be certain. In fact, the only certainty is that there is no certainty. And Browne committed to skepticism, which is really odd when you consider that he was also a religious person, because he thought that faith took you out of uncertainty. Yeah, we can ask ourselves all these questions, do I exist, etc. But at the end of the day, you've got to have faith. And his faith was a faith in God, which is why he's buried in the church. But he actually remains important for us today because he is somebody who didn't just want to accept things. And that's what Socrates was. Socrates was a skeptic. Socrates didn't want to just accept things. He actually asked, how can we know? How can we live? So it seems to me we've come full circle, all the way from asking what philosophy is to saying, how can we live? How can we know? What should we do? These very basic questions, which have been interesting philosophers ever since the time of Socrates. They've been interesting philosophers in India ever since Indian thought first started with the Vedic text. They've been interesting Arabic philosophers. They've been interesting Persian philosophers. They're still being asked by Zen philosophers in Japan. All over the world, people are asking these questions. And the point of doing a philosophy degree is to ask the questions and to put forward your answers. And it's your answers that I'm actually very interested in. And that's why I teach philosophy. And I hope you've enjoyed walking around Norwich today. I hope you've enjoyed working as a philosopher while you walk. The great subject for doing your walk on. If you want to be a philosopher, walk very slowly, as Taleb said. And I'd like to thank very much everybody who's listened to this, and I wish you all the best for the future. Thank you.